right, and we are live. So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our March Listening Club. I've been really on top of my game. I even changed it to say March Listening Club, so it doesn't say January anymore. really, really coming along. But before we get started talking about Supertramp, I am going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So, if you've been here before, you know all of this stuff. But this is our monthly listening club. We do this every month. Also, monthly, we do a movie club where we actually had our movie club meeting for March yesterday, where we discussed the zone of interest, and that is still up online, so you can watch that. And if you have an opinion on that or anything that we say in that, you can actually leave a comment, and I do my best to keep engaged with those comments because I just like talking about movies and music and books. So let me know. But we also have a book club, but that meets quarterly, and we will be talking about Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro at the end of next month, at the end of April. So our club panel is actually full. I keep these down to a manageable size just so it's not people talking over one another. But even if you're not able to join us, on the call itself, we actually see comments when they're coming through live. I do know that most people watch this on the replay, but whether you're watching it live or replay, if you post a comment, I'm going to see it and I'm going to talk to you about it. So you can absolutely join us that way. And you can find us on Facebook. I've provided the link on the screen to our Facebook page. We don't just have these multimedia clubs there. It's just a collection of artists who discuss issues and creativity and projects they're working on and getting some feedback. We also have a Saturday morning call where we talk about things. Sometimes it's more along the lines of habits, and sometimes it's a little bit more philosophical, but it's always a good time. If you're in the Los Angeles area, we also do meetups occasionally, and you can find all the information about that on the Facebook group. And if you like what we do and you'd like to support us, you can actually support us on Patreon for as little as $2 a month. At this time, everything that we offer is open and free to you, but we appreciate the support if you have the means to give it. I think that is everything. So let's talk about Supertramp, Crime of the Century. Had you guys heard this album before?
No.
I had heard the two singles, and I think the title what's the last song on the album? Is it the title track?
Yeah, it's Crime of the Century.
The title track got airplay on the sort of more adventurous FM stations, but I had never heard the whole album.
What about you, Tim?
I after the monstrosity that was Breakfast in America, the band went on tour and they released a live album. And this album did not do much in the United States when it first came out. So I was completely unaware of it until after Breakfast in America. And then Paris came out and they released the live performance of Dreamer from this album. And I think that's when Americans went back and said, oh, look, they have all these albums before Breakfast in America. And I bought this on cassette, and I was going to LA City College at the time, and I had my ghetto blaster with me, and I played this album over and over and over and over again. So I couldn't even give you a number of the amount of times that I have listened to this album.
One of the notes that I actually have was that this album was incredibly popular in the UK, Canada, Germany, Australia, and France. UK, Canada, and Germany, it stayed at top, number 1 for a little bit. And Australia and France, it was in the top 10 for a while. So it was actually kind of weird that the US didn't get into it. It was 50th at its top position on album rankings. So yeah, didn't do much in the US.
But it ultimately sold. It ultimately won platinum status.
Yes.
Because of the number of listeners that picked up on it well past, the date it was released.
Do you prefer this album or Breakfast in America?
Now, I like the songwriting much more on Breakfast in America. Logical Song irritates the hell out of me. I never listened to it because it got played to death back then. But there's a lot of development in the songwriting between this album and Breakfast in America. So the craft of that album is perfect, but what they ultimately became this is the foundation album. There were 2 other albums before that, and they're both interesting, but this is the album where they begin to sound like the band that everybody fell in love with back then.
Yeah, well, the entire band left after the second album. They made this album because they were about to lose their record deal, and they had to come up with ways to make money. But the entire band left except for
Rick and Roger.
Yep. Davies and Hodgson is what I wrote down for some reason. I was like, I don't remember their first names. I don't know why I didn't. But yeah, so this is their 3rd studio album. The entire band, except for those 2 who are the lead members of it, left after that because it was such a failed thing. So they brought on Bob Siebenberg, Jod Helliwell, and Dougie Thompson. Dougie Thompson. Yeah,
you would think it was Dougie because he's Scottish, but Dougie is actually how he goes. His full name is Douglas.
But I think the funniest thing that I found out about the history of this album was that the album is dedicated to someone whose name I am absolutely going to mispronounce, Stanley August Muziekhuis, who was a Dutch millionaire who actually financed the band through their first 2 albums. And he also backed out of financing them and wrote off $90,000 worth of loans that he had given to the band. And they were in such dire straits that they asked Chuck Berry for cash. They actually backed him up a few years before this album came out. So they knew him and asked him for money, and he said no. So instead, they wrote a lot of songs for this. Some of the songs actually ended up on the soundtrack for the 1971 film Extremes by Tony Klinger. And then somehow only 8 of them made it onto this album. And in fact, the album that comes after this, Crisis, What Crisis, I think is the name of the album, was released so quickly afterwards that most of the songs were actually originally written for this album and then scrapped for this album. And so as a result, they think that that is the least put together album. So anyways, that is my background on this. I just thought it was really funny that a millionaire was financing them and then pulled out all the financing, and they were like, crap, we have to write an album. Yeah.
Just 2 other quick things on background. Those first 2 albums, the first one, I think it came out in 1970, and the songs sound like they were written in 1967 or 66. Very psychedelic. It's like being in a lava lamp for 45 minutes. And then the next album, the previous album, all the lyrics were written by Richard Palmer Smith, who would go on to write King Crimson's lyrics in their most important albums during the mid-70s. But Davies and Hodgson start really writing their own songs, and Davies as a performer starts to show what he can do. He comes from an R&B rock and roll background, and so they start playing more rock and roll. And then if you listen, you can hear to those 2 albums, you hear how much they've developed. Both of them have developed as songwriters by the time this album comes together, and with a solid band behind them that would last, for 10 more years after that.
I also learned through listening to this, because I didn't really listen to Supertramp before listening to this album, but then I ended up listening to it and I realized I actually know a lot of their songs, and none of the songs that I know are on this album.
Until Breakfast in America, they never even cracked the top 10. Give a Little Bit was their biggest song at that point, and they only got that up to 15 in the US.
Right. Was Give a Little Bit, I think, actually came out after.
Even
Did
in the
it?
Quietest Moments was the album before Breakfast in America.
Okay. I was like, I thought it was after, but it might have been a year before. But I don't know. I am not an expert on this.
Yeah, I thought this was the album before Breakfast in America. It's not.
No, I
No,
know that there is Crisis, What Crisis, at least in between them, but I thought it was one in between, and then I
Oh, what
thought
was?
no. To
the next one.
even in the Quietest Moments was the follow up to Crisis, What Crisis. It's a relatively weak album compared to Crisis.
Yeah.
The songwriting is a bit stronger on Crisis, but it doesn't have the consistency of this album. This album, all these songs, they just kind of feel like part of a whole, and Crisis, and even more so, even in the Quietest Moments, feel like random songs that came from other places, and they
That's
don't.
because that's exactly what it was. It was
Right.
this album that was crafted, and the rest of them were all the rejects from this album.
And then Breakfast in America was just, them working their asses off and writing a very solid, coherent album, even for the weak spots on it. The strong parts are probably the strongest songs they ever wrote.
I personally prefer Breakfast in America over Crime of the Century after listening to both of them a couple of times. And it has caused strife in my family because the entire reason why I picked this album is because this is my dad's favorite album. Or one
You
of
mean
them.
favorite of all albums or favorite Supertramp album?
I definitely favorite Supertramp album, but when I asked everybody in my family what albums we should listen to, and this was my dad's choice. And then when I said I picked it, he got so excited. Like, this is pretty high up there for him. And when I was like, I think I prefer Breakfast in America, he was like, no.
It's a short.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Beckett.
I was going to say, it's a short album. I was surprised.
Yeah.
You mean this one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Breakfast in
There is an
America is a
extended
harder
version, but-
album. I apologize, Beckett. I stepped on you again.
It's all right. I am just pointing out things that are verifiable facts. There is an extended version. I didn't get a chance to listen to it.
I think the extended is the second disc when it came out is mostly live performances of these tracks.
Yeah, I don't usually listen to the deluxe versions unless it's like the Japanese release, which usually adds on like a couple more songs that were like more demo-y. So I guess my next question is, do you have a favorite song on the album, and what was it?
Is Dreamer the one with the big piano riff at the beginning?
Dreamer.
I think so. Yeah, I had to listen to it. It's not available on YouTube Music for some reason, so I had to listen to it in one big long chunk. So I think that's the one I like.
Tim, Miguel, any?
Oh, Bloody Well Right might be the one you're talking about. That has a piano intro to
Yeah, they
it
both
as
have
well.
piano intros. One has electric piano, though, I think.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, no,
like
it was
it's a
more
whirly,
towards-
I think.
I think it was more towards the middle of the album.
That would be Dreamer.
Oh, that would be Dreamer. Yeah, it is a Beckett. Yeah, or Becca. Yes, it's a Rebecca. That is a Wurlitzer on that. A lot of Wurlitzer playing on
Yeah.
Supertramp albums.
Yeah.
With a chorus pedal.
What about Tim, Miguel, favorite songs?
Oh, probably School for me. That's the most rockin' track on the whole album.
I don't know. Maybe Bloody Well Right.
I think mine is actually surprisingly Asylum for some reason.
You know, that one, I was surprised. That one kind of reminded me of The Wall a little bit, where it's kind of proggy and very
Yeah.
sort of emotional and stuff. Even though the topic of the lyrics is more like, what do you call it? Dark Side of the Moon. But it just like, it kind of surprised me. And anyway, I did want to add that, you know, everything. I'm only. So your dad's not going to like me either. I like Breakfast in America a lot, but it was like the biggest album of the year in either my junior or I think in my senior year. Yeah, because I was working of high school, right? So the stuff was everywhere. And then I thought there was a lot of really good songs. I really liked the drumming. Who's Bob Seibenberg, who's from Glendale. I wonder if the rest of the band that joined before Crime of the Century was also LA guys. But anyway,
No, they were all
what's that?
They were all UK.
Oh, okay. So it was just Seibenberg, who's from LA. Anyway, but I thought this was like, it's not to the point where it was like a different band, but it's sort of like, you know, like Genesis has their proggy albums and their pop albums. This is kind of like the proggy version of Supertramp, but it didn't connect with me like the proggy version of Genesis does. And but I did agree with everything Tim said. I thought it was the album right before Breakfast in America, so that part of my theory goes to heck. But if this is their most realized album before Breakfast in America, you can see where the things are being developed that could become Breakfast in America. And I wonder if Breakfast in America was more poppy and had more shorter songs, so it was more radio friendly because that's the way they were naturally developing, or if the A&R guys at the label were hammering them for something that could be a hit on the radio. Because I know they were really struggling financially when they were making Breakfast in America, not after it, but before it, you know? And one of the songs is about like when they were, oh, that's a big digression. Anyway, I'm not going to digress. But like whatever reason it was, I appreciated it. Like if it was their A&R guy being an asshole and saying, you got to get something on the radio, so I love it because I really like how they developed from this album to that album. I think the songs are better. I think the arrangements are better. The melodies are better. The drumming is better. I really like the drumming on Breakfast in America. And on this album, he's just like, he was like a young 20-year-old guy that somebody needs to tell, don't hit the drums so hard. Just back off, dude. You know? So there's development on all sorts of levels between this and Breakfast in America. And so, I mean, want to ask you, Rebecca, is your dad an audiophile? Is he really into like really cool stereo gear and stuff?
No, he's just very into the things that he went to in his teens. So he went to like a few Supertramp concerts, I know.
Oh, he saw them on the tour for Crime of the Century?
I think probably Breakfast in America, but I didn't ask him exactly. He has a lot of nostalgia for things of, you know, his younger days. So that's more of where I would put him. I mean, so do I.
Anyway.
Listen, we'll do Britney Spears one of these times.
I revised my answer. I like Asylum. That's the song I was thinking of.
There you go. We have 2 votes for. I'm changing my pick to Asylum too. I mean, I did like that album. I just, you know.
I thought School was going to be like a hit. Like School was the big hit on this album. I think that it's important to note that, I mean, these guys specifically got together for this album and then wrote the songs together for this album. And despite the fact that I think everybody in the band has said in like various interviews that this was like when they were at their artistic peak and like all together and communicating well, I still think they were like relatively new in the way that like their bonds were. So I feel like we had this, and then we had them doing their contractual obligations where they didn't have a lot of time to write it. And so it's kind of like not necessarily a sophomore slump, but kind of a sophomore slump of like, here's all the songs that we didn't put on this album. And then they finally got a little bit of traction with Breakfast in America. And so they sound more cohesive, like as a band, because for this album, they were just barely a band.
Yeah. They're just, new to each other. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, what I find really interesting is that I think as Roger, as Hodgson and Davies start to not work together as much anymore,
Mhm.
their songcraft gets better and better.
Right.
Because historically, from Crime of the Century on, they're starting to fall apart personally.
Mhm.
But during that time, the songwriting just gets so much better and better. But the thing that's very obvious, you can, even if I didn't know, if you played a song for me, I could tell you who was the primary writer on it with just by listening to it. Because they have two very, very different styles of writing, both lyrics and music. So I find it interesting that as they start to fall apart as a partnership, their songcraft gets better.
I mean, Fleetwood Mac also kind of did that. Or like, yeah, they when they start like writing very separately from each other, like the songs are better somehow. Um, I thought it was interesting with this album. A part of their contract actually stated that they both had to write all of the songs. So they all say that these were all written by Hodgson and Davies, but it's very obvious to tell who wrote them because they very clearly wrote them separately. And I think it's very clear based on who the lead vocals are.
Yeah, kind of like Lennon and McCartney.
Yeah.
But you know what you're saying is also a nicer way of saying is as they realized their own musical aesthetic, they got better at that, but farther apart
Yeah,
as a cohesive band unit.
which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Yeah. But they did get much better. I think the songwriting on Breakfast in America is on another level compared to this album, as good as it is.
Yeah. I actually don't have a lot to say about this album. I really wanted to listen to it, and I actually think the background on it is like really cool, and I really like the places that they gone from here, and I'm glad that I picked it because I would never listen to Supertramp otherwise. But I think for me, this album this is going to sound crazy. But as soon as I finished listening to it, I kind of forgot that I listened to it. Like, I really enjoyed listening to it, and I know I enjoyed listening to it, but I kind of turned it off, and then I was like, now what was I just listening to? And I don't have that with Breakfast in America, which is probably why I prefer that album.
I think one of the things that you're picking up on there, and because I went back and listened to everything again in preparation for this discussion, and I think I knew it, but I never articulated it to myself before. But Rick Davies' songwriting, his lyrics get more cynical and more, I don't want to say angry, but he gets darker. And I think that lends a contrast between his songs and Hodgson's songs that makes Breakfast feel like a more dynamic album. It really is a much more dynamic album in terms of how the feelings of the songs, because Hodgson is this very zen, I'm in this happy place, or oh, I'm sad, whereas Roger is, I'm angry, I'm sad and I'm angry. And he's or Roger or Rick's in love, but there's always when he's in love, it's this, I'm waiting for something bad to happen. So where Hodgson is always very positive, Rick's always got this very cynical attitude that comes out in the writing.
It's kind of like
Maybe.
Lennon and McCartney, but they hate each other.
It was almost like I really enjoy the things that are being said, but nothing was like quite hooking. Like, I don't know, there was nothing quite to sink my teeth into on this album a little bit. I actually think for both, like, the next two albums are pretty weak, but I feel like there's a song or two on both of them that like I could latch onto a little bit. And as another fun fact, I made my way through 1001 albums to listen to before you die. Like every single day, there's like a website that will generate one for you every day.
Wow.
This is on there. It's in the book for 1001 albums, but somehow Breakfast in America isn't. This is the only Supertramp album. And after listening, I didn't listen to their two beforehand because I didn't have a lot of time, and I kind of was like, this feels like the actual start of the band. So I'm going to listen to like the next stuff. As much as I enjoyed listening to it, this wasn't, I wouldn't consider it their best album. So it was just really weird to me that this is the one that they decided to.
And that list, it might be designed to be things that you wouldn't have listened to. Like Thriller is probably not on there.
I think it is.
Everybody's heard it. Is it really?
Yeah.
Okay, well, there goes my theory. Never mind.
I think it's just like a few people though. Like I think it's just a few music critics that are putting together, and it's been through a few iterations.
So this is the reason I asked you if your dad was an audiophile. So this album, like, is deified in certain quarters, and like if you went into a stereo store in the late 70s, early 80s, they would have this to demonstrate the stereo equipment, right?
Interesting.
And other albums they might have had Dark Side of the Moon. I'm trying to think of what, but it was kind of proggy stuff. It wasn't popular stuff. If Thriller was out in 83, you sure as heck didn't see people using Thriller to demonstrate stereo equipment. It tended to be sort of white and proggy, which is probably their market for people who could afford nice stereo gear. And Mannheim Steamroller, God, those guys drove me crazy because the drum sound was just awful even back then. And the drum sound on this album, part of the reason this album drives me crazy is the drum sound. He's hitting too hard. The drums, I don't like the tuning and the muffling. It's just like, stop hitting so hard. Get the tape off the drums. Anyway, neither here nor there. But it was like a real big deal. Like every stereo store you would go into, they would use an album like this, or Mannheim Steamroller, or something from Pink Floyd, to demonstrate the equipment, just because of the quality of the recording. But it would never see Breakfast in America. Right?
I think my dad might have just been very into prog rock, and I think he might have been a bit of a stoner.
Well, yeah, and so like I would agree with that, because I think this is a much more proggy album than Breakfast in America.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It's kind of soft prog, though. It's not prog in the way that Yes and Genesis are prog. I think the reason it gets labeled prog is more, it's not really typical pop songwriting. It's not, verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus. It's, you can, some of these songs you struggle to find if there's even a chorus in them. There's a lot of them are not a chorus. And so I think it's prog in that way, that it's not, it's more atypical in terms of the songwriting than so it's a proggy pop, but it's equal parts both, I think.
Yeah,
I would agree with that. And so when I'm making an analogy to Genesis, I mean post Peter Gabriel Genesis, where it was getting more song based. So Trick of the Tail, Wind and Wuthering, those two. Which I think, what year did this album come out?
74, 75?
This album came out on the 25th of October, 1974.
Okay, so those albums came out after this. But it is sort of more accessible song-based prog, as opposed to the craziness that would happen on a Peter Gabriel Genesis album. But yeah.
Now, Supertramp's first album sounds more like prog, because it is coming out of that 1966 through 1970 kind of thing. It really sounds like it could have been recorded in 1966. That's how proggy it sounds.
Yeah. And another thing I wanted to mention is Ken Scott either produced or engineered this album. I just saw that on the credits.
Yeah, produce and engineer.
And that might have been why they were in the stereo stores, because he had a real good name back then. I forget whoever he was working with, but he worked with a lot of different people, like Dixie Dregs and Mahavishnu Orchestra and Billy Cobham, and then like pop bands like this. So then Tim, when you say their first album was even more prog than this, I haven't heard their earlier stuff. So this that totally makes sense, that this sounds like an album where somebody's making the transition from prog to the more song-based stuff of Breakfast in America. Not that it's unproggy, like Breakfast in America definitely has some drawn out instrumental moments. I mean, the lead track, like takes 2 minutes for anything to even friggin' happen. But yeah.
Sorry, I'm like looking it up because I'm like prog is like feels the same thing as like pop to me, where it's just like, what does that really mean?
Well, that's the Beatles effect, I think.
Yeah. But I mean, Miguel also talks about it a lot of it's just where do you put this in a store? It means absolutely nothing.
Oh, yeah. Well, back then, I guarantee you there wasn't a prog section, right? There was just proggy bands in the rock section.
Yeah. The other thing that I really want to talk about, and this is really just because I found a lot of information on it, and it's something I never really find a lot of information on, and I'm like want to include it. So the album cover, I go back to the album cover, was done by Paul Wakefield, who is a man who this was his very first time working with a band. So this is his very first album cover. I'm gonna mute you, Beckett.
Oh, sorry.
What was she doing?
She's typing.
Oh,
I couldn't hear it, Becca. That's interesting because I would have assumed this was something like Hypnosis would have done. What's his name again? His last name?
Paul Wakefield.
Paul Wakefield. That sounds familiar.
Yeah, he's.
Covers did he do?
I didn't recognize, like, it wasn't like anything that I fully recognized. But he did a lot within like UK music scene. And the weird part about it is I had the same thing of like, what else did he work on? And you can find he does not talk about his album covers at all. He does landscape photography now and like fine art photography, and like everything on his site, everything about that it's all about just landscape photography. That is what he does now. He doesn't talk about his album covers that he's done, but he did a lot of them when he was like younger. But I think that this is interesting, one, because it's a composite shot, so it is a double exposure of the hands on the grate.
Yeah, how would you make that back in those days? Is that
the
how
background is actually just a black piece of paper with holes poked in it?
Oh.
Yeah, so the way that it works is you expose it once and then you expose the same thing again. So instead of going click, you would go click and then click again on something. And then anything that's black on the first one would get filled in with whatever is more light on the next one. But the reason why I really wanted to talk about it is because I found an interview with him, and I have never seen this before, but here is his concept art. I literally am just bringing this up because I love the fact, and this was his first draft. He did other drafts where it looks more like the original one, but I couldn't stop laughing at this. And also I was fascinated by just having an interview with a photographer being like, here is my concept art. And then he showed his concept art for like other album covers that he did. And I just never seen that before. And I really wanted to talk about it.
Do you have a list of the other album covers he did?
Let me find this interview again.
It's okay.
I honestly, it never occurred to me that this was a photograph. I always thought it was a painting. Aside on the back cover, there's a picture of, I think, the starry background and the band in one corner. And I thought I knew the picture of the band was photography, but I always thought the rest of the package was a photograph. A painting.
Yeah. So he also did the cover for Crisis, What Crisis?
That's an
Vangelis. Cover. Yeah, that's an interesting cover. Vangelis, Heaven and Hell.
Wow.
City Boy, Dinner at the Ritz.
No idea.
Yeah, I don't know most of these.
So he didn't do a lot of it. He did
it when he was Susie and the Banshees.
Oh, which one?
The Scream.
Ugh. I can't remember the album cover. What is the album cover, Tim?
I have no idea, but it was your reaction to it.
Oh, no. I meant, I can't think of what the album looks like. I love Susie and the Banshees. She's awesome.
Yeah, it's somebody diving into water and then just a foot in the foreground. I don't have the concept art for that one.
This is a really cool album cover.
And then he did an album cover for Sally Oldfield called Water Bearer, where he took a photo of a waterfall, and that got him into landscapes, and he's just been taking photos of landscapes ever since.
Well, there you go.
I find it interesting, Miguel, that you thought this was hypnosis, because that had never occurred to me before. And I see, looking at it now, I see little stylistic hints that are kind of hypnosis-y, but I never would have thought of this as hypnosis before.
Well, they were also doing everybody's album covers back then too. So
I also like the idea that he went behind this, where it was kind of a combination of, you know, crime of the century, now you're behind bars, but also lyrically it relates to asylum and like a specific line in it.
Yeah.
It makes me think of the 3 criminals from Krypton in the Forbidden Zone from the first set of Superman films.
What?
Yeah, nothing. I got nothing there.
Okay, so Superman, the original one with not the original one, but the one with Christopher Reeve. His father, Jor-El, banishes these 3 criminals, which is General Zod and General Zod's 2 henchmen, and he banishes them to the Forbidden Zone, which is kind of like this strange prism that floats around in space. And he banishes them to that, and we frequently see the prism floating around in space with them at the, you know, on the window, you know, looking out and screaming.
Wow. That's
on YouTube somewhere.
That's a deep cut.
It's for our Comic-Con fans that are watching right now. That thought goes to you.
That was my big thing that I wanted to share that I learned while researching this album. I think I said most of the other things. I was expecting this to be a little bit of a shorter call, but I do want to make sure, does anybody have things that they want to talk about in regards to this album?
Well, I would love to just, the songwriting is interesting, because after Bloody Well Right, all of these songs are kind of sad. They're about sad people, sad, unhappy people, which I think it's part of my not my dislike. I don't dislike the album, but it's part of the reason that I don't listen to the album as much, just because Rick Davies isn't angry yet, so I don't hear his angry songs. But I go to Crisis What Crisis, and even in the quietest moments, and I hear that fire that he's got. And he also is much more aggressive in his playing. And so this album is a bit of a downer for me once you get past Bloody Well Right.
It's interesting that they have all said that this album is the most coherent. Because, yeah, again, the next 2 albums are just like the leftovers from this album. So, like, there was some sort of vetting process. And I guess what it was is containment and depression.
You mean coherent like it's a concept album?
It's not a concept album, but they did pick the songs and they think that it like meshes together. So I guess in that sense it is a concept, but I don't think that it was like, here is the idea we're going for. It was more of a, these are the songs we wrote that we think go together.
Yeah, I think that's what it is, more than a concept album. And I think the sound from song to song, particularly once you get past Bloody Well Right, it's a very flat dynamic. All the songs have, kind of this, the characters are similar. They're all sad, depressed, lonely. But there's nothing that really punches you in the face once you get past Bloody Well Right. And there are tracks on Crisis and even in the quietest moments that punch you in the face. And then half of Breakfast in America punches you in the face. There's real rock and roll tracks there that I don't think are on this particular album.
Yeah.
I definitely would have loved this in high school.
So
kind of a gothy prog rock album.
Oh, you
that
mean
was a lot of
like I was going to say I love Breakfast in America in high school, but that doesn't count. My hand goes down. Sorry.
I haven't listened to it, but it's I haven't listened to like any Supertramp. This is the first exposure I have to them. I might know a couple of their songs, like the more popular ones. I just need to hear them again because I don't know them off the top of my head. But I listened to a lot of like mellow, dark, like classic rock in high school. So
There you go. Awesome. I have a quick oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I was like, you definitely know Give a Little Bit.
Because everybody else has re-recorded it a million times.
Yeah, like you'll hear that song and you'll be like, oh, this is who did that.
Yeah, you will have heard stuff from Breakfast in America too.
Yeah,
I'll have to listen to it.
There you go.
One of the really, I think, and this is getting past crime of the century, but I think one of the interesting things about Breakfast in America, and this is when you had album-oriented rock, which is why this could happen. You had 4 singles that charted on this album, but you also had deep cuts that were getting played on AOR stations. You had the 4 singles, which were Take the Long Way Home, Logical Song, Goodbye Stranger, and the Logical Song. And then you had Gone Hollywood was a deep cut that got played a lot, and so did Child of Vision. The opening cut and the last cut got a lot of airplay on AOR stations at the time. So theoretically, you had like 6 singles on that album out of, I think, 10 songs.
And I'm certain, I've never heard this album, and I'm certain I heard Crime of the Century on radio. Right. So along with the 2 singles, the Bloody Well Right and Dreamer.
Well, School got played a lot on AOR too. So you had 4 songs off of this album that got lots of airplay. Dreamer didn't get picked up until after the live version was released in 1980. Dreamer was released as a single when this album was released, but I don't think anybody in the States really noticed it until the live version was released in the States in 80.
I think AOR radio stations picked it up, but you may be right. Yeah. But I mean, the fact that I heard Crime of the Century in America when this album did nothing in America, says something about the state of radio and album-oriented rock back then.
I mean, top 50 is not nothing in America.
Yeah,
fair,
but I mean,
it is not
compared with Breakfast in America, when it's the biggest album of the year, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think what was going on is they weren't getting played on pop stations, and they weren't, because the record just didn't really hit here, and they weren't getting played on, rock stations that would play hard rock, because this is not hard rock,
It's not.
They were in this weird space musically that American radio just wasn't really interested in, until Breakfast in America.
I have a quick anecdote about Breakfast in America. I know it's a digression. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Oh, no. Generally, when I talk about, especially when it's something like Supertramp, Crime of the Century, I don't think we're ever going to come back to Supertramp, even though I like Breakfast in America more. It's just we talk about 12 things a year and music.
Wow, you're banishing Supertramp.
Yeah, no more Supertramp. Get it out of here.
We're kind of a one and done group.
But there's so much music to talk about that I'm open to discussing the band in its entirety. I pick an album so that people can listen to it and use that as a jumping point. But I mean,
well, here's an idea for Rebecca, if you want to get more into them, is pick up the live album from 80. It's called Paris, and
it's the greatest hits. Yeah,
every song except from Crime of the Century, except for one, is on that album. They performed all those songs on that tour. And it also has all the very best songs of their other albums as well. And
that's the Breakfast in America tour, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Cool. This is Child of Vision, but I have to live with that.
I think I will check that out, because I think what I've determined from listening to this album is that I really like listening to Supertramp. I don't think about it often, but whenever it's on, I enjoy it. So I probably should listen to it more.
And then you don't have to think of it again. So that's a good thing, maybe.
Yeah. Maybe. And then I can listen to the album again, and I've already forgotten it. It's great. Flawless.
They were
every time.
They were such a tight band live. A lot of bands go out live and they have a hard time being as tight as they were in the studio. But during those years, these guys were smoking hot live. They, just incredible performances from all great musicians.
Yeah.
That was another interesting thing that I actually read is they spent a really long time rehearsing this album, but for the next two, they weren't given that rehearsal time.
No.
So the next two albums are actually not rehearsed before them recording it.
Hmm.
But it's not usual when I do this research that I hear so much about them being like, we couldn't rehearse, it's awful. Like, I don't usually hear that from bands a lot. So they clearly put a lot of emphasis on practice and their rehearsals together. And I think that that's part of the reason why they became so tight with each other is they know each other's playing style pretty well.
Hmm.
That was very common in the 70s in the rock world. They wanted you to go, you did your album, you went out on tour, and you came back. If that album was a success, they were like, okay, get in there and write me another one because we need to hop onto this success. And if a band couldn't consistently, release stuff that was successful, the labels would drop them. A&M actually dropped them before this album, and their manager convinced A&M to re-sign them.
Oh, wow. So speaking of A&M, I don't know if this was at A&M Studios, but when they were in the studio recording Breakfast in America, they were in the same studio as Fleetwood Mac while they were recording Tusk and Steely Dan while they were recording Gaucho. And some of the lyrics from Breakfast in America referred to, not having any money and eating at the Taco Bell. And that Taco Bell line came from the fact that Fleetwood Mac, this was post Rumors money. So they had the best catering. They had this massive catering going in and out of their rooms. And then the guys in Supertramp would have to walk down the street to the Taco Bell to eat. And really jealous of that and stuff. But that's just so interesting that those three albums were being made at the same time in the same recording studio. And I'm sure Fleetwood Mac, the Tusk album, a lot of that Lindsey Buckingham did at home. And I'm sure Fleetwood Mac did that album in a bunch of different places. But just to think of those three albums all happening in one place at the same time is pretty amazing.
I didn't realize Taco Bell was around back then.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I grew up with that.
I'm in a Taco Bell without a hope in hell. I can't believe that I'm still around. It's from
Yeah,
that line.
Watching the Fleetwood Mac catering.
It's funny because Taco Bell recently did a Back in Time thing where they revived all of their menu items from different areas of time. And yeah, I mean, I think that the 90s were the best one.
There you go. I'm not thinking the 70s was a good place to visit for Taco Bell, but I could be wrong.
I don't eat at Taco Bell a lot, but during this campaign, I was working on a big project. So I was working 12 to 14-hour days, and Taco Bell is the closest thing to my house.
I see a lot of restaurant interior porn, which is it has Taco Bell interiors during the early 90s. Seems to be a fascination for people.
I eat arguably too much Taco Bell.
It's inexpensive. And it puts food in your belly.
It's delicious. I'm a bad Mexican.
You're Mexican? I didn't know that.
Half.
Cool. That's why I couldn't eat so much of it. I had to hide it from my mom. That stuff was not coming into the house.
Nope.
I was just thinking another good album to check out if you're interested, if you like Roger Hodgson's songwriting. His first solo album, Eye of the Storm, has got some really interesting songwriting on it, and the title track was a big hit for him.
Yeah. I might go a little bit more down a rabbit hole on these guys because, like I said, I greatly enjoyed listening to the album, even though I can't remember any of the songs right now. So, interesting spot to live in my mind.
Yeah, how much of that is the album? How much is your mind? But yes.
Yeah. So I actually am interested in listening to more both Supertramp and offshoots of Supertramp.
There's a lot of live video on YouTube. The songs that I gravitate to are the ones where Rick Davies cuts loose on piano, because he's such a great player and he loves to jam. And
Didn't they release a video with Paris?
Yes,
That live stuff is the video from the Paris.
They did a
live album.
DVD.
Yeah, or well, would have been VHS back then, but yes.
Yes, you're right. It would have been. Well, actually, no, I don't think it was ever released on VHS. It was something when they were going, whoever owns the material went back and said, hey, we should put all the unreleased stuff from the Paris shows onto, into video, because we have video for it. They released it. I think it came out at the beginning of this century, actually.
There you go. Wow.
There was a lot of outtakes from Paris.
My favorite Genesis album is the Seconds Out live album, which was also recorded in Paris, or most of it. There you go.
We are coming up on an hour here. Is there any other thoughts that anyone would like to give on this album?
Make sure you listen to Breakfast in America.
Yeah, listen to Breakfast in America. The biggest takeaway from this talk.
After Roger
leaves, wrong with this album, it's just sort of this
is a great album, but Breakfast in America is a better album.
Yeah, this is sort of part of the process of getting ready for Breakfast in America.
After Roger Hodgson leaves the band, they did two more albums for A&M, and actually after that they kind of disappeared. But that very first album after Roger Hodgson leaves, called Brother Where You Bound, is a real prog album. It's a prog rock album. And it had a single called Cannonball, which is kind of a poppy thing. Not verse, chorus, verse, chorus. It's just, it's all verse. And it's a Rick Davies feature, a lot of great piano playing on it. Bob Siebenberg is, featured on the drums. It's really a great feature for the two of them, but great song. But after that, their next album is just kind of, what the fuck is this?
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
We're trying to end this on an up note, and we're not. Maybe.
and I'm taking you to the end of Supertramp.
Yeah.
Did I mention listen to Breakfast in America?
That is, we spent more time discussing that than we did Crime of the Century.
I think we talked about the band in general more than
Yeah.
anything else, which is honestly kind of how I expected this call to go.
Well, what's good about that is like some bands, you can have a really, really popular album that isn't maybe your best work. And they at least, I think their best work, if you just look at it purely from a songwriting point of view, and melodies and all that stuff, I think their best work was their most popular album. And that, worse things can happen to a band,
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and end this stream. So thank you guys for joining me. I'm going to announce our next pick tomorrow. So jump in the Facebook group to find out what we're going to be discussing next month. And if you'd like to join, let me know. And on that note,
I'm still surprised that we discussed Supertramp. I never expected us to be discussing Supertramp in this group.
I think the next one will be less surprising. We're staying in the 70s though. So usually I try to jump through time, and I didn't do that this time. We're sticking in the 70s. So
oh, wow. Are you serious? Debbie Boone? That's awesome. I'm really excited. There's a drum fill named after Debbie Boone. Pat Boone, Debbie Boone. Very much looking forward to it.
Oh, that's funny. That's very funny.
All right. Thank you guys for joining me, and I'll catch you on the next one.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.